Oh my God, I'm sorry.
There we go.
Yay! Thank you for telling me. Sorry, I had no audio. It's my fault. I just pressed mute. Cool. Can't script me. It'd be amazing. Okay, you could try. Yeah, Jared.js. All right, great. So, anybody have any questions on what we built so far?
That's awesome.
Yeah, just a Express app that's rendering a single template. Okay. So, does anybody need a explanation of how Pug works? Because it doesn't look like HTML. Looks a little bit different.
Yeah.
Great. Pug is a white space sensitive syntax. So where we would normally do something like a div with like a span in it and then some text, and then you have to come down here and you have to close that span and then you have to close that div. And I've chose this formatting, right? We could do that, but I've chose this indentation formatting because it denotes the tree, right? So Pug is a syntax that does not require that you use any closing tags, because the concept of being inside of another element, being the child of an element, is done by indentation. So if we want what we have there, we just do div span and then hello.
It's kind of like Python.
Python is also white space sensitive, yeah. If I were to do this, the span would be next to the div, right? And so that's how we're going to get this tree structure. And I actually really like it. I think that it's annoying that we have to use closing tags because it's just one more thing to forget and to mess up, right? So if we're doing white space sensitivity in this, we can't forget the closing tags, right? Yeah.
Well, so don't you prefer or recommend JS?
I prefer people start learning about templates and what templates are by something that looks closer to the thing that they are creating. Now, EJS isn't specific for creating HTML. EJS is a generic templating language. Pug is specific to HTML. So EJS is easier to learn, I think, because everything you write is exactly what you would have written before, except you have a little bit of special additional syntax. Pug is like a totally new approach to HTML. It has a couple of features that are nice because it's built specifically for HTML. It has better support for layouts and partials and mix-ins. And
I've never been able to get partials to work.
Oh, yeah, we can do that. We can get partials to work. And so you can do things like render another file from within this file from within like a loop, right? So you can say like for every user in the users array, render this other user template as that thing. So it has a little bit more power because it's built for HTML, but it's also just a weird place to start when you're learning templates, because it's just, you're also learning this other new syntax, right? Whereas EJS doesn't bring as much new things to learn. Cool. All right, so we want to make a modal. So in order to do that, we're going to need some styles. So I'm going to link to /styles.css, and we're going to need a script tag, which is this one href? I can never remember.
I think CSS is href, right? I think it's yeah.
See, the link is href. Yeah. Okay, great. So now this will be script.js, and then these things don't exist yet. And in order to serve these, I'm going to just make a public directory. So I'm going to come up here and do app.use express.static for the public. Oh my God, public directory. And so now if I make a public directory and I make style.css and script.js, should have those two files. Anybody confused about this command?
So just to clarify, what you're doing right now, you're serving static files from the server, right?
I'm setting up Express to serve static files from a directory, and then I'm putting my my JavaScript and my CSS as static assets in that public directory. So I can come in here and say that the body has a background color of red, and in this script, I'll just alert 4. And so if this is working, I should get an alert of 4, and my background should be red so that this works. But like I'm getting that, but we're not getting the style sheet. So I'm going to go to the network tab, and I don't even see it trying to require that style sheet. So what's my HTML turning out? I've got a link, but I think the link requires.
You have to do a dot.
I think you need to just say rel style sheet like that. So when I did this, I also needed these things, I think. Is that what you're saying?
No, I was thinking the /. Is it dot
This?
Yeah.
No. I absolutely want this to be an absolute path. Relative paths to assets are should be avoided if at all possible. Oh, and I named it style. That's fine. There we go. Okay. Do you know the difference between this and this?
No.
This is an absolute path. This is a relative path. So if I was on the web page like some deep path, right? If I was on this page, this would still work because this is an absolute path, whereas this would be resolved to some deep path /style.css, and that's not where it lives, right? So we always want to use absolute paths when we're linking to our assets if possible.
Okay.
Because there's a place for relative paths, but they're very rarely used. Like when would you want to say like get the style sheet that's relative to the page that I'm on? So if I move to a different page, like you're gonna get a different style. It's like you could do that, but why would you do that? Cool. Okay, so this red's got to go. I'm gonna use a reset style sheet. I'm gonna use normalize.css. Because you should almost always use a reset style sheet unless you're using a framework that already has one. And I'm just going to link directly to the CDN for simplicity's sake, but we could also install an NPM module and require it from there. But I'm just going to grab this and go into here and just make another link tag that goes first. And now we should see that this text is like butted up against the wall here. That's because the reset style sheet changed a bunch of stuff, and some of that is remove the padding from the body. Cool. So now we can say that the body is background color lime. Let's just get something a little less violent here. Great. And so let's add some content to our page. Does that work?
You don't have Samuel Ipsum?
I don't have I should have hipster Ipsum.
Yeah, Ipsum.
It's pretty good.
Khalid Ipsum.
What is? Cali?
Yeah, Khalid Ipsum. It's one of the major keys to success.
Major keys.
Did that not work? Oh my god. What? Why? All right, well, whatever. It doesn't matter. Cool, so we have some content on our page here. Great, and I'll put a button here that is gonna have the class, I don't know, open modal.
Use a typo button.
Oh, thank you. I thought that looked weird. And then I was just like, nah, I guess that's not. Okay, notice the buttons are really super ugly. Cool. Okay, so we've got a page here, and we want this to just open a modal for us. And the page has enough content to where we're scrolling around. I'll probably add some more. Let's add some more content. Just so that we're always scrolling. Cool. All right, so I'm going to build this modal already on the page. I'm not going to make like a dynamically generated modal. So so I'm going to put here just modal. So if you put nothing in Pug, it just defaults to a div, which is kind of cool. So I can just say dot modal, and now I have a div with the class modal. So it's a little bit more shorthandy. So I'm going to say modal, and then inside of here, I'm going to do a modal dash window. And in here, I'll put an H1, hello from the modal. Cool. So in the style sheet, by default, I'm going to say all modals are display none. And so now that's not visible, right? And they're also going to be position fixed, top left and bottom right 0. And so I'll turn this off just for displaying as we style this modal, right? And I'll give it a background color, black. And now you can see it's covering the whole page. So I'm actually going to do RGBA. I think it's 0.75 or something. We'll get you a nice shade of gray. There we go. So we've got our nice shroud. Is what I call the background of a modal, right? So we've shrouded the page, and you can see we can still scroll. That's a problem we'll have to deal with, but I'm gonna deal with that in a second. Cool. And now the modal window, which is a div inside of the box, I'm gonna give background color white, and we're getting there a little bit. It should be a little bit confusing and why this modal window isn't all the way at the top. And that's because we've got this H1 in here. If I get rid of if I stop having this H1 in here and I just make this, you know, a div with some text in it, then our modal window is all the way at the top, right? But if it was an H1, it pushes it down, which is really weird. Why would the inner content of this element be fucking with the position of its wrapping element? And that's because of something called margin collapse. This H1 has margin on it, but occasionally, and you can get into a situation where the margin of an element here is actually being pushed up to its parent element and putting the margin on its parent element. It's like a really weird thing. Nobody really wants it. There's a bunch of different ways to solve it. But I think it just gets solved by default if you, for example, there's a couple ways to solve it. You can put, you could put some padding on this element. So if I put an inner padding of 1 pixel, now the margin collapse goes away. There's other ways to fix margin collapse. Yeah, putting padding on it. That's not what I want. There's got to be overflow auto maybe does it.
Can that override the margin for the H1?
You can. You could take off the margin for the H1 for sure, yeah. But I actually want the H1 to have a margin, right? So if I do overflow auto, I actually like that the H1 is like not butted up to the top of this white box, right? I want the margin for my H1. I just don't want it to collapse up into the parent, right? So overflow auto is actually pretty cool. Can we do overflow none doesn't fix it, or overflow hidden doesn't fix it? Oh no, overflow hidden fixes it. Cool. So overflow hidden is actually a pretty good way to do this, because we don't want the content, if it was to be wider than our box or taller than our box, to like flow outside the box. So overflow hidden is going to keep any content that would overflow our box to just be hidden. So overflow auto is actually a pretty good way to stop margin collapse. So I'm gonna put overflow hidden here. Overflow auto is kind of cool because if it overflows, it'll introduce a scroll bar. So maybe we'll do overflow auto and see what we can get. So I'm gonna put some more content inside of our p tag here, or excuse me, inside of our modal here, just to give us some more content there. Okay. But a modal window is supposed to kind of be shrunk in a little bit, right? So the way we're going to accomplish that is I'm going to use Flexbox. So I'm going to say that the display of this modal is going to be flex. And I'm going to need to remember this because actually I want all modals to be display none by default. So I'm actually just going to do this now. I'm going to make a modal-open class that will just say display flex. And then, so now I'm going to put back display none. So all my modals are display none by default now. So the modal's gone. Yeah. But temporarily, we'll hook the button up later. I'm going to come in here and say modal and then give this also modal-open. So now it's display flex. And you can see that the modal is there and the modal window is there too. It's just taking up 100% of the space. Does that make sense? Did y'all follow that?
So the modal open work overrides it because it appears below.
Correct. Correct. And you can see that here in our modal element, we've got the modal styles come first and then are superseded by the modal open. And that is because it is lower in the style sheet here. So I'm giving a bunch of default styles plus one that just says don't display at all, and then giving it another class that I can toggle to open and close that thing. So now we have display flex. Cool. So I'm going to put the rest of my Flexbox stuff just directly on modal. So I'm going to say flex direction column, and I'm going to say align item center and justify by content center, and that should force my box to take up as small of a space as it can vertically and horizontally. And then my modal window, I'm going to give a max width of like 90 view widths and a max height of 90 view heights. And so now it should be relative to how much space it has, but squished in a little bit. I think another way I could have done that is probably just put a margin of like, I don't know, some amount of pixels. Yeah, so I could have put a margin of like 30 pixels around it, and that would have worked too. Maybe we'll go with that. Yeah?
Yeah, would those both be responsive? Or would that be a whole nother?
I mean, responsive usually means you're using media queries to change things, but it looks fairly responsive in the sense that like, even if we get down to a really narrow window, here we'll switch on responsiveness here. Let's just go to responsive. So even if we get really tiny, this box should be positioned fairly good, yeah? And if we get really wide, we should have scrolling inside of our inner box. Yeah? Cool. Sweet. So here's our modal window.
Need a close button.
We do need a close button, yep. I'm also going to give my modal window a bit of padding. Cool. And if I did that padding, I wouldn't have needed this overflow auto. If we remember, that's one other solution to, but I like the scroll and I like the overflow auto, right? Because when we get really small, we can see the content. Sweet, so we totally need a close button. Let's just put one in there. So I'm just going to throw this right inside the modal window, and then I'm going to come into my style sheet here, and I'm going to say any modal window or any modal close element that's inside of a modal window is going to be position absolute top right. And I think that's actually going to put it up here, which is not what I want. So why that's happening is because when you position an element like this button, you say position top right, it's positioned relative to its closest positioned parent. So if we look at the modal window, this is not either position absolute, position fixed, or position relative. It's not positioned. It doesn't have the position property on it. But this one does. This is position fixed. So if this was position fixed top pixels, right? Wherever this positioned parent is, that's where this inner child's positioning is relative to. right? So we actually want our modal window up here, and we actually don't want this to be positioned relative to the shroud. We want that top right of the window, right? So if I go onto the window and I make it positioned, so I just say position relative. Now this is the closest position parent, and so the positioning of the absolute positioned element to the element that is closest in the chain of parents that is positioned. It's like so many of the same words over and over and over. And so we say position relative because we could do anything. We could say position absolute, we could say any sort of positioning here. But position relative by itself is not going to change anything about how your element is styled. We could put like a top 10 pixels and then it'll position this thing like relative to where it was supposed to be positioned. We don't actually want that, but by putting this, we change what the closest position parent of the modal close button is. So now it's relative to this element instead of the element above it, the parent of that element. So this is about absolute positioning, and absolute positioning is super, super useful. So playing around with this where you create a div and inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div, and you give one of them a position and then make the inner one position absolute, and you see how that plays around. Like you should just play with that and just like get used to that structure.
So if the shroud didn't have any positioning?
It did. The shroud was the closest position element because it's position fixed.
Yeah, so I'm asking if the shroud didn't have positioning.
Yeah.
Would it go to the
Sure,
same spot? Would it
sure.
position
So
relative
turn
to the
off
box?
this positioning. It would, because it would then become the HTML element, the window element. So if we come to the shroud here, which is just the modal element, we take off display or position fixed, now we're way up here. We're actually relative to the body now. So it now scrolls with the body, right? Cool. So we need to give modal window position relative, and now we have our X at the top right there.
Could you add, since the close button is a Flexbox container child element, could you do like a line item?
We could, but that's not that. Yeah, we could have done something like that, but Flexbox is meant to give you either rows or columns, right? So when we look at this, what we've got on the page here, right? This content, this inside this box, well, actually no, because I'm doing display flex on this element. So it's only affecting the children of modal here, which this is a child of the modal window itself. And I could have used this Flexbox on the modal window, but that would have been, but like, I would only do that if I wanted rows or columns, right? And so I want this X just to be at the top right. Maybe in another layout with another design, we would do like a header to the modal that had an X in it, and then I would do columns, or rather rows, because I would have a header row and then a content row, right? But it's just not the layout I was going for.
I think you can add Flexbox properties to the child elements too.
To the children of the children?
To the children of the Flex.
Right, but this is the child. This element has Flexbox.
Oh,
this
that
is
one
the
does.
child. This element is a child of the child, so I don't think Flexbox will affect more than that. But this positioning is totally fine. I think it's a totally fine approach to do it this way. And now we have a button that we can click. And you notice how that blue outline is cut off? That's because we did that overflow auto thing,
Oh, cool.
which is cutting off the overflow. That would normally overflow, right? Cool. So great. So now we have a modal, and now we just need to like hook it up. Yeah. So now we're jumping to JavaScript here, and we'll say document ready. I can never remember how to do that, but I don't want jQuery, so I'll do -jQuery. In the 21st century, no, I don't want your library. How about we just do JavaScript document ready event. There we go. DOM content loaded. That's what I wanted. Okay, there we go. So we can say document add event listener DOM content loaded, and it should tell us when the DOM is loaded. And it did. Cool. Everybody know why we have to wait for DOM ready? Yeah? Okay, great. So then we'll do document.query selector for a modal. And make sure we get that element. Great, and we got this. That's funny, it changed the way it was rendering it. So we have this modal element here, and if I right-click on it, I can say Reveal in Elements panel, and then up here it'll show me that I've gotten this element here. I also need to get the Modal Open button. I called this Open Modal and this Modal Close, so I'm actually going to switch to be more consistent because consistency is super important. I'm going to switch this to modal dash, well, I already have modal open for the modal being open.
Maybe change the button to...
I know, yeah, so I'm going to change this to open modal, and I'm going to change this one to close modal. I don't like that. I'm going to change this to modal close button and modal dash open dash button. And the reason I think this is more consistent is because it's got that prefix. Everything's got that modal prefix, which I really like. So modal open button and modal close button. I don't need to style them yet, but I just need to have them. So let's start with that. We're going to get the modal open button.
Do you need to change the CSS class names as well?
I didn't change any class names in the CSS that...
Modal open. Oh, just the button.
I just changed the button, but I didn't style the button. Okay. So, all right. So in my script, I go get the modal open button. So I'll name this modal open button. And I'm getting that button, great. And so now I'm going to say add event listener click. And whenever anyone clicks this, we're going to prevent default. There isn't a default on a button, but it's just safe enough to do.
What does that do?
If it was a link, right, because right now I'm just getting an element with this class. It could have been a link. It doesn't have to be a button. So if it was a link, it would have gone to that link. Right? And I don't want that to happen. So I want to stop whatever the default behavior of this click is. And now I'm going to find the modal. I'm actually just going to store the modal up here. And then I'm going to say modal.classList.add modal open. Oh, and we need to actually start with our modal not open. Great. So we got our gross green page. We click modal open, and it goes and finds that modal, and it adds the modal open class to this thing. And somehow we lost. Oh, I did style that. You were totally right. I'm sorry. The modal close button is now modal close button. You were totally right. Sorry. Great. So now open modal, and now we've got these things here. So we want close modal, and we actually, so we want to do that one. Any
space be behind dot modal and window?
Is what space?
You have modal dash dot window and then a space and dot.
This?
Modal. Yeah.
Yeah, this is super important. This space is incredibly meaningful. So this CSS selector versus this CSS selector. Anyone know the difference between these two?
That's it's on the same div if it's combined.
Yeah, exactly. So this one on the bottom, I find it very helpful to read CSS selectors from right to left. So this says an element with the class modal close button that is a descendant of an element with the class modal window. This means an element with both these classes.
And then the greater than is the immediate child.
Correct. This means an element with the class modal close button that is a direct descendant, an immediate child of an element with the class modal window, which is true in our case here too. But I just care about anything that's in there. That's a super useful, super important, use it every day way of structuring CSS is by saying this element gets these styles, and then when it's a child of this other element, it gets these other styles, right? Very useful. Cool. So anyone have any suggestions on what we should do to make this thing close?
Maybe a toggle that removes. all
Well,
that.
we will ultimately be doing a toggle, but this button never needs to open the modal again. So it doesn't need to toggle. It's not an open close button, right? It's just a close button.
So just the added event listener that removes the open modal.
Yep. But what
Class.
element do I add the event listener to?
You add it to the close modal button.
The modal close
Modal
button, yeah.
button.
So great, yeah, I know, right? Cool. So we will duplicate this line down here, and we will make this the modal close button. And then we will add an event listener for when someone clicks it. We will also prevent default, and then we'll say modal class list remove modal open. Let's see if it works. Boop, 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 boop. Cool. There's another tricky thing inside of modals that I want to go through because it is a cool example of like event bubbling.
Okay.
When you open modals, sometimes you want, when you click on the shroud in the background here, you
Yeah.
want it to close.
It's close, yeah.
Right? So we're gonna do that, but it's gonna be problematic. So this element that is this shroud is this modal element, right? So I'll come in here and I'll say, okay, if anybody clicks on the modal element, we will close the modal. Yeah? So now if I come in here and I click the shroud, it closes, and if I click this, it closes, we're good, right? But if I click inside the modal, it also closes, right? Why does it do that? Because click events bubble up the DOM. So even though I clicked on this H1, right, it had a click event here, which then bubbled to this element, which then bubbled to this element, which then closed the modal. Yeah? So how do we fix that?
You could just change the color of the shroud, and then it would like instead of the shroud being that black color, you could just set it to have no color, and then it would look like the shroud had disappeared, but then the modal would still be open on the screen.
Right, but we don't want that. If the modal's open, we want the shroud.
Okay.
Yeah. What we're trying to aim for is that if I click on the shroud, the modal closes just like if I click the X button. We just don't want the modal to close if I'm clicking on something inside the modal, right? Because if there's a link in here or something, like I want to be able to interact with this, but even just selecting text will cause this to close, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I'm going to jump in the debugger here. Whenever we click on, whenever this close by modal click event happens, right? So this won't go in the debugger if I use, oh, it actually will if I hit that X anyway, because we have that same bubbling issue, right? So I'm gonna restart, reload, open the modal, I'll click on the H1, and now I'm in the debugger. So we look up here, and we're paused in the debugger here. So now I can look at what the event object is. It's a mouse event. It tells me on the screen where it was clicked and stuff. But the most important part for what we're doing right now is the target of the click, right? What element was initially clicked on is the target of this event. And that's this H1. That's what I clicked on, right? So we can ask ourselves, was the target of the click, the original click event, was it inside that modal window element? And if it was, we're not going to close the modal. Does that logic make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? So we can say modal. We still have access to all the lexically inherited variables here while we're in the debugger. So we can say modal contains, I think, or maybe it's event not. I can't remember how to do this. Is child of or something? Okay. DOM is element child of another. Oh, that has got to be a better way. Contains. I knew there was a contains. Node contains. Okay. So now we can say, does the modal contain the event.target? And if it's true, we'll say, so if the modal contains the event target, we're just going to return. We're going to do nothing inside of this handler. So now I can open the modal, I can click inside these elements here, and the X still works, and the clicking on the shroud, oh, clicking on the shroud doesn't work, so I guess an element contains itself. So if we do like document.body.contains document.body, is that true? It is true. Okay, so for some reason contains, when you give an element itself, it's also true. So we need another case for this, right? So we need to know if the event.target is the modal. So if the event.target is not the modal and it's inside the modal, right? Is that it? If the thing we clicked on isn't the modal, then close. And the thing we clicked on is inside the modal, then close. I think that logic's right. Let's just play with it. Huh?
Let's try it.
Yeah. So I can click on these things; they're inside of it. I can click on the shroud; it closes. I can click on the X; it closes, and I can still click in here. So this is a fairly successful modal we got going on here.
Yep, modal's kicking ass.
Cool. Any questions about that event bubbling stuff?
That was cool.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can you just go over the most part?
Sure. So if I click the open modal, just adds the open modal class, and that's why the CSS changes, and we now show the thing. The close modal thing, the close modal button, pretty simple. You click that button. There's no content in that button, so there's no bubbling issues there, and it'll close the modal. But if you click on any content inside the modal, it's going to trigger this click, because all those clicks are going to bubble up to this element, right? So again, if I click on this H1, it bubbles to this element, which bubbles to this element, which triggers this event handler. So what we need to do is say, was the element clicked not the modal? If it was the modal, this is false, and so we close. So if the element that you click is the modal element itself, we close the modal. So if it's not the modal, we don't. So, and then if the element that you click is inside the modal, we also do not close the modal. I think we actually, this is too complicated. I think we just need to say, if the target element that you click is the modal, close it. I think that's simpler. Open the modal, clicking on this, don't close it, click on the modal directly. Got it. So this is a little bit simpler. This is great. So we want to make sure that the target of the click event is the element that is specifically the element, is and is only the element that we're talking about. Whereas normally when you add a click handler to something, you'll receive click events for that click handler if someone clicks on an element inside that element, because those click events will bubble up, right? So basically, if this event was bubbled up to us, don't do anything. If this event originated on the modal element itself, then close. So that way, when I click on the children of the modal element, it does not close, but if I click directly on the modal, it closes.
When do you like to use ternary statements instead of if? I've seen you do both.
I haven't found a case in this example. If it's a one-liner, you know, if it's like, if I'm setting a value like name equals, you know, first name question mark, first name else unknown name or something like that. If they're short one-liners, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's go look at it. This sounds like target is the modal. Is it?
Yep. Maybe this will help.
Maybe I just don't know where we structured it and what exactly is
Okay, here's the HTML right here. Okay, so the modal element is this outer div that's position fixed and covering the whole screen and is the shroud. Okay, and then inside of it is the modal window. and then inside of that is some content, right? So if I click on this H1, see how the target's the H1, or I click on this P tag, or I click on the modal window itself, right? These are the three children. This button I could click on, but it has its own click handler to close, so I won't show that as an example. But these three elements here, I can click on them, and this, it's bubbling up and firing this click handler, but only when the element that I initially click on is the modal does it close. So you can see this last one, it was the modal itself. Does that clarify things?
Yeah, just so quickly on, like, because earlier when you were clicking on an H1 that didn't have an event listener, it was bubbling up and still closed.
Yeah.
So now it's not doing that.
It is still bubbling up, right? But it's not closing because we have this if statement, right? So here, console.log closing modal versus not closing modal. So I open this. If I click on the H1, our if statement says we're not going to close the modal because the thing you clicked on isn't the modal element itself. The original event target isn't the modal itself. Click on the P tag, it won't close. Click on the window itself, it won't close. But if I click on the shroud, which is the modal element, then it will close. Yeah? Cool. All right, there's another thing that I like to do with modals, which is I don't like the background to be scrolling in the background here. So what I will normally do is when I open the modal, so now I'm actually going to make some utility functions here. This is going to be open modal, right? And then close modal is going to be this. And then down here, we have some duplication, right? So now I've dried up that duplication by putting those two different duplicate lines of code in a function. So we still have a modal that works, I think. Cool. But when I open the modal, I'm actually going to also get the document body and add a class, showing modal. And then when we close the modal, I'm going to remove that class from the body. And what the showing modal class is going to do is just going to say overflow none. And that's going to turn off the scrolling ability on the body element itself. So now, even though I'm able to scroll up and down, so I'm scrolled down a little bit, I open the modal, and now that did not work. Overflow hidden, maybe in here. Let's try.
What are the other options in the overflow?
Yeah, I think maybe visible. No. There we go. Overflow hidden will do it. So open the modal. Let's do overflow hidden. Open the modal, and now you can't see it, but I'm trying to scroll real hard, right? Let's illustrate this a little better by putting a few more P tags inside of our modal. And I'll shrink our window. So our modal has some scrolling, but notice it doesn't scroll the background. I don't know if you can see that. Is the shroud too dark to see that? Let's turn down the shroud real quick, and I'll turn off this overflow hidden. And you'll see if I'm scrolled, right? I got the open modal right here. I open the modal. It also has scroll, but when I hit the bottom, it starts to scroll the background, right? That's like one of those, I think, weird behaviors of like, okay, I'm scrolling through this inner scroll. I guess you really want this, but I'm scrolling sort of both. Does that make sense? And I don't really want this for a modal. I think you'd probably want this for some other situations, but if we turn on overflow hidden, now I can open the modal and just scroll willy-nilly Yeah? What's up?
How would we keep the closing button from appearing over?
Oh yeah, we would have to add another layer of elements. We'd have to add, we'd probably have to do something like make a modal window content element which has overflow auto on it. And then in here, we would take all of this inner content and wrap it in an overflow window content. So now, oh, that's weird. Why am I getting so much more padding here? Oh, yes. Man, I'd have to play with this for a second. I'd have to give this some more styles, which would be like, this might work. No, that did not work. Man, this is a great question. How about I answer this after I finish this this other thing, which we will not have time for. It is a good question, and let me finish this. So I think it's actually done. So if we make this smaller, oh no, I screwed up because I took this off. There we go. Okay, so we've got our small scroll window here, and we can put our shroud back to something. And it doesn't scroll the background of the window, and then I close the modal and I can scroll again. So does everybody at least understand that this, so I can try to move forward, this adding a class both to the body and to the modal, so to open the modal and show the body, or and stop the body from scrolling.
When would you use DOM element dot style and then have overflow?
I don't like to put any styles if I can avoid it in my JavaScript.
Okay.
Class names, just right, because showing modal tells you what this does. If this line of code was overflow hidden, I'd have to figure out what that meant. But at least this has a name. It means, you know, or I could call this stop scrolling, maybe, would be also a good class name.
Okay.
Or disable scrolling might be a better, more declarative class
So
name.
for the naming convention, that's why you would use classes instead of just.
Yeah, I prefer when I have the chance to give something a name that I add additional clarity to my code by naming it. Yeah. Cool. How would we make this thing work? So the problem with this internal scrolling thing, right? This is what you were trying to avoid, is that X scrolls away, right? It's absolutely positioned inside of this modal window element. So actually, I'm actually a little surprised that it's there. I figured if it was absolutely positioned, it wouldn't be part of the scroll content. And you can't do this because this will fix it to the top of the page. Yeah. What's up?
We put it in a separate div and then like see access to the object, so that's like separate.
That's essentially what I'll have to do, but I'll have to put it in. I have to put another layer of elements here, so I can say these things are part of the scroll content, and this thing is not. Right? I have to separate those out, which is not the way the Markdown's working right now, which is that both the button and all these things are part of this same modal window element, which has, and this is the element that has overflow scroll or overflow auto and is scrolling this content. But I'm still surprised that the absolute positioning scrolls with it. I don't know why I'm surprised by that. I think I'd know that by now. So what I essentially want to do is put this content in another div so that it can be the element that scrolls. But now what the problem that you get with that is this element modal window here is also sort of deciding how big to be, based on its content. So there's this relationship between like the stuff inside of you and it declaring how big you should be, but then you also being able to say, but I have a maximum I can be. So if I get below that maximum, now I restrict and start scrolling. And so that kind of two-way relationship gets a little tricky when you start to put another box inside that has the overflow scroll on it. But it's totally doable. How can we do it? Let's keep trying this technique I was trying before. I would normally take more time because I don't mind doing more than an hour lecture, but I have an appointment that I have to go to. So that's all I can do for today, but we can cover more of modal stuff later. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. That was awesome.